Hello everyone, Simon here, and welcome back to our ARCHMINE100 series where we are learning architectural concepts through Minecraft. So this is the 7th lecture and we are going to talk about public space. More specifically, urban public space, because we talked about parks and gardens in the last lecture and last series of exercises. So let's just start with the really big ones, the spaces of superpowers. So this is the National Mall in Washington, D.C., specifically National Mall during the March on Washington in 1963. This was when Martin Luther King Jr. made his I Had a Dream speech. So a very, very important moment in the civil rights movement in the United States in 1963. And you'll notice that it's full of people because that was the whole point. They were protesting, they were marching on Washington. So the National Mall in the United States is a national park directly next to the state capital, or the federal capital, I mean, the center of US government. Normally it is a tree-lined lawn with a few monuments nearby and a reflecting pool in the middle. So you see the reflecting pool there, and there's the is that the Washington Monument? I think it is. And then there's other buildings around it, and then the capital, I think, is in the distance. Yeah, behind the monument there. And usually it's just kind of mostly empty. I mean, there's always people there. There's always kind of tourists milling about. But on most days, there's not that many people. However, occasionally, it is the site of major events. For example, presidential inaugurations happen here. And as you can see in the photo, occasionally you have massive protests. I mean, a protest this big doesn't happen very often. But when they happen, they are also very important. And, sometimes, you wonder, like, why do you waste so much space on the National Mall? Like, nobody goes there. It's just a big piece of lawn with a fountain in the middle, or like a lake in the middle. But then, a protest like this happens, and then you understand that a nation as big as the United States needs a square this big because once every few decades you have things like this, and it's really important. And of course there are other events too, like concerts take place here, and as we said, presidential inaugurations take place here, and that usually fills the space as well. But it's this stuff, like the protest stuff, this is important. This is Red Square in Moscow. So the Soviet Union was definitely a superpower. Russia still is pretty strong, but not quite as big as the Soviet Union was. So it's located right next to the government. In this case, it's located right next to the Kremlin, which is the center of the Russian government, all the way back to the time of the Tsars, back to Imperial Russia before the Soviets. Notably, every year they have a Victory Day military parade marking the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II. So every year they have kind of a military parade through the square. Curiously, political protests are quite rare, especially during the Soviet era. But yeah, so not, whereas here we see the massive protests in the National Mall, the protests in the Red Square are kind of rare. And the size of the Red Square is actually limited by the surrounding historic buildings, which is preventing expansions. If you see that there, it's basically surrounded by important historic buildings, and there's really not enough space for it to expand. So for a huge empire like the Soviet Union was, the square really isn't quite big enough, given how many people might gather here. But you don't want to demolish these fancy buildings around here, so too bad about that. This is Tiananmen Square in Beijing, China. China, I guess we can call it a superpower now. It's pretty big. It is located right in front of the Forbidden City, which is the Palace of Imperial China. It's also adjacent to the Great Hall of the People, which is the seat of the Chinese National Assembly. So the center of government today is also next to the Tiananmen Square. So again, a massive public square right next to the central government buildings, right? So the Tiananmen Square is mostly just a wide area of paving, and occasionally it is the site of military parades, usually marking the founding of the People's Republic of China. Is it on the what day is it? I think it's the 10th of October is the National Day of China, or is that something else? I don't quote me on this, but you kind of Google images of military parades in Tiananmen Square, and you'll probably find pictures of that. So again, on most days it looks like this. Like you see these people just kind of milling about, not doing very much. Like it's a massive area of paving, and there's really not much in it. But again, occasionally you have very important events. Infamously, in 1989, the Tiananmen Square protests, which ended in bloodshed, and that was not a good time for anybody, especially not for the protesters in the square. But again, a very important cultural event, a very important political event that, in some ways that were not ideal, defined the politics of China for the decades that followed. So yeah, I mean, spaces like these are important. And as I keep saying, on most days they're just large empty spaces, and then on very rare occasions they become very important and very full of people and very politically charged spaces. Slightly less extreme because we're not talking about superpowers anymore. So spaces of civic participation, this is the idea of the people of a city being involved in the politics of the city. I mean, this is the foundation of democracy. The idea that people can gather and talk and do things and have an influence on the politics of their country, right? So this is Piazza San Marco in Venice. This is a picture of it from 1730. Piazza San Marco is located adjacent to St. Mark's Basilica and also the government buildings of Venice. And so this place is the center of Venetian civic life. So the main basilica is there, and the government buildings are also there. Historically, the site of civic ceremonies and also serving as the square for the basilica. Yeah, so it's the church square and also it's the city square. Today, it's mostly a tourist destination because Venice is not an independent republic anymore. It is part of Italy. And it is a very very famous a destination for visitors to the city. Of course, with San Marco is still there, and all the historic buildings are still there, and also a number of very expensive cafes and restaurants are there because tourism. Also, it's the center of the annual Carnival of Venice. The Carnival of Venice have been going on for a long time, on and off, but they revived it relatively recently, and so every year there's a carnival in Venice, which is fun, and also a tourist magnet. So, yeah, so it's just a space in the city where people can gather for various reasons, right? Here is Piazza del Campo in Siena, Italy. We've seen the city of Siena before when we talked about color. This is the main square of it, which is very interesting because it actually is semicircular and it slopes down like an amphitheater. So at the bottom of the picture, out of the frame of the picture, that's the Palazzo Pubblico, which is the historic town hall and government center of the Republic of Siena. And like the space literally is shaped like an amphitheater, so you can imagine a politician might make a speech at the town hall, and then the people will be kind of gathered around the square to kind of watch him. So it acts like a theater, the shape of it, and actually and then it slopes down as well, so it's actually exactly like a theater. Nowadays, once again, there's a number of restaurants and cafes around the perimeter because it's it's no longer a civic space, and it's no longer it's not a civic space in the sense that it's not a political space anymore because again, the Republic of Siena is not there anymore. It's part of Italy now, so it's become another tourist attraction. And you might notice in the picture here that there's people just sitting on the square. The way it works is that because the square slopes down, it's actually not too bad to sit on. I mean, the slope is very, very shallow, so you can barely feel it. But it's enough for people to sit on it, because the way you sit in amphitheaters, because it's okay to sit on if it's sloping, even just a little bit. So that's interesting. There's a lot of people just sitting around. This is Piazza Navona in Rome, Italy. Spaces of events and commerce. So Piazza Navona, if I remember right, was never a government. There was never a government building next to the square. So this was more just a space of commerce and events. So markets happen here. Historically, markets happened here, theatrical events happened here, and festivals were celebrated here. So it's a quite a popular public space because it's like an open space in the middle of Rome. And again, you see a whole lot of cafes and restaurants around the perimeter. You can see that in the picture there. And there's three rather famous Baroque fountains with very nice sculptures around them. There's three fountains, a long rectangular space, and again, it's really just an open space, but because the city of Rome is so dense with buildings that, if you want to meet someone or if you want to just kind of hang out with your friends, like where do you want to go? Well, let's go to the piazza, right? So it's just you need spaces. You just need open spaces in cities for people to gather. Not to mention all the special events and protests and whatnot that we've talked about already. So these things are important, even if it seems like it's just a big open space with nothing in it. No, but that's the point. You need a bit of this because people need spaces to hang out in. You can see like people walking their dogs and people sitting around. And there's I think stores. Yeah, I think they're selling drawings or they're sketching people. A lot of tourist things, and of course the restaurants. Moving onwards to slightly more modern times, this is Federation Square in Melbourne, Australia. And like the Piazza del Campo in Siena, it features a sloping square. So if you kind of look down at it, you see all the buildings behind there. Those are like art galleries and office buildings and whatnot. And bars and cafes, again. But in the middle there, there's like a square, kind of. And it slopes down. I think it takes its inspiration actually from the square in Siena. And the focal point of the square is at the bottom of the picture there. You can't see it because it's facing away from us. But there's a giant television screen facing towards the square. And it will often broadcast like sporting events and other events. And so, if there's a big sporting event going on, you'll find people just kind of hanging out in the square, watching TV out in the open with other people. So instead of watching TV at home, you just kind of go out to the square and watch TV with everybody else. So that's kind of fun. It also is next to the city's busiest train station. So again, off the screen, at the bottom, so to the bottom of this picture here, that's the what's the name of it called? Flinders Street Station, which is the busiest train station in Melbourne. So again, if you want to meet someone in the city, like just saying, well, let's go meet in Federation Square, that's like easy because it's close to transportation, it's well known, it's an open space, so it's just one of those spaces where the location is in the middle of the city, and so it's just convenient to hang out and meet people there. I think the bars are quite expensive though. The thing with new buildings and new squares like this is that it takes a lot of money to build new buildings, and so then the rent is expensive, and then the businesses that can afford the expensive rent can afford to have a space in the square, and so then everything's expensive in new buildings, unfortunately. Maybe over time, maybe in the next few decades, things will get a bit friendlier in terms of prices. But I think you can still see, yeah, there's umbrellas and tables. If you look closely at the picture, you can kind of see where the cafes and things are. There's umbrellas and chairs, and there's a bar in the bottom left, and I think the thing on the right side is a cafe. I'm not sure, but again, food because food is good. Restaurants and cafes and bars in every city square. So this is Times Square in New York. Interestingly, New York, which is widely considered the capital of the world, given that it is the home of the United Nations, New York doesn't really have a main square. I mean, there's a place called Times Square, but it's not really a square. It's an intersection between 7th Avenue and Broadway. So it's like a road. It's a busy traffic intersection. which is curious. That such a large city and such an important city in the world doesn't really have a main square. Occasionally, it's the site of events and celebrations. Notably, every New Year's, there's like they drop balloons and things in Times Square in New York to celebrate the New Year. So in December the 31st, 1999, 2 million people gathered at Times Square to celebrate the new millennium. Or rather, 2 million people tried to gather at Times Square because Times Square is not big enough to fit 2 million people. And so basically you had 2 million people milling about, clogging the streets around Times Square because there's no space in New York that's big enough to fit 2 million people. And it doesn't look like there's going to be any space there anytime soon because the prices of the land is so expensive that no one's going to pay to have a large city square in New York. So it's pretty odd in that way. Although in recent years, I think they've made part of Broadway pedestrian only, and so I think the area around Times Square. So I think 7th Avenue is still cars, but I think parts of Broadway is now pedestrian only. So they've turned the road into a pedestrian space. So I guess it's a bit better in terms of trying to use it as a public square. But it's still a bit odd that they don't have a proper square. But it's okay. I mean, Times Square is pretty famous and it works fairly well. And there's advertising everywhere in Times Square. So this is the Champs-Élysées in Paris, France. It's a grand avenue, as you can see. So the curious arrangement in Paris is that they do have a main square, the Place de la Concorde. I think I'm pronouncing that wrong. But they do have a main square. The square itself is not very big. But what they've done is they've put it at the end of this massive avenue. Look at this avenue. There's 10 lanes of traffic, and then trees, and then a massive sidewalk, and then more sidewalk where shops and cafes can actually, if the cafe extends, you can see it in the photo, if the cafe extends out into the sidewalk, it still only takes up half the sidewalk. So the sidewalk is massive, and then there's 10 lanes of traffic, and then there's trees. So this avenue is massive. It is so big, and so look how long it is too. So the city square itself is small, but if there's a whole lot of people, they just spill out into the avenue. So it's like you can extend the square as long as you like because there's a massive avenue right next to it. So the official square is small, but if you have a massive parade, for example, then you just take up the whole avenue, and that's fine. So it's like an extensible space for the city, which is pretty clever. I mean, it's pretty clever if you think about it. If you don't need a lot of space, then just hang out in the square. But if you need a lot of space, then block off the traffic, and you have the whole avenue. It's a major tourist destination, as you might expect, with many famous shops, theaters, cafes, and historic buildings lining either side. Also very expensive shops, very expensive cafes. Everything's very expensive in this place. But very famous. You can buy very expensive clothes if you're into fashion. Occasionally the site of protests, celebrations, and military parades, and also the final segment of the Tour de France, the bicycle race. Famously, historically, every time Paris was conquered or liberated, there's a parade here. So in the First World War, when the Germans conquered Paris, there was a parade. And then when the Allies liberated Paris, there was another parade. And then in World War II, when the Germans conquered Paris again, there was another parade. And then when the Allies liberated Paris again, there was another parade. So there's a lot of, it's funny when you put it like that, but obviously the wars were pretty tragic for Europe as a whole, and France in particular, because it took place in France a lot of the time. And so there's a lot of history here too. There's a lot of war and everything else. So spaces like these, the longer they exist, the more history they accumulate, and the more important they become. And this is, it's already quite important in Paris. A convenient staircase. This is a rather unusual public space. It's the Spanish Steps in Rome, Italy. Again, we're back in Rome. So there's a staircase built in front of the old Spanish embassy, connecting it with the nearby church. You see the church up on the top of the hill there? So there used to be just a cliff there, and the people at the Spanish embassy, if they wanted to go to church, they had to kind of go the long way around. So at some point they built the staircase between the embassy and the church. And people didn't really expect how popular the stairs would be for sitting on. Now, if you kind of look back in hindsight, obviously a giant staircase in the middle of the city would be really nice to sit on. And the funny thing is, like, if you just go look up any photo of the Spanish Steps, you'll always find people sitting on it. Almost always, you'll find people sitting on it, unless it's snowing or something crazy. So in this picture, it doesn't snow in Rome. If you look in this picture, I don't know if you can see it clearly, but on the right-hand side in the shade, there's a whole bunch of people sitting on the steps. It's kind of too hot to sit in the sun, but they're all sitting in the shade there. There's also fountains in front, as you can see. So in every single photo of the Spanish Steps, you can find people just sitting there because it's the middle of a big city, and there's a lot of tourists. And if you want to rest your legs or something, then where do you go? Just kind of find a staircase and sit on it. If you go to the very top of the staircase, you can look out over the city, look out over the rooftops of the city as well. So the view is quite nice from the top of the staircase. And the staircase has become so popular to sit on that eating lunch on the staircase has been banned by law. So if you do it, you can get arrested and fined. Because, I mean, imagine if you let people eat lunch on the steps. Everybody would just eat lunch on the steps, and then you can't walk up the steps anymore, and there'll be rubbish everywhere. So in order to discourage people from blocking the stairs and littering, they had to ban eating lunch on the stairs. That's how good these stairs are as seats. Which is this kind of odd thing with I mean, I guess with all public architecture, like sometimes you don't expect what will happen. Like they built the steps for people to walk to the church, but it turned into great seating, and then they had to ban people eating lunch because it's great seating. So that's interesting. So when you design things in your cities, just kind of keep in mind that you never know how the people are going to use your spaces. They might kind of come up with these new ways to use your space that you just don't expect, and that's good because if it's better that they use it than they don't use it. If you just ignore your space, then you design the space poorly. Beaches can also be public spaces. This is Copacabana Beach in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. It is one of the most famous beaches in the world. There's 4 kilometers of scenic beachfront, and it's only one beach. There's other beaches in Brazil or in Rio de Janeiro. Like, Rio de Janeiro is quite famous for its really big and really beautiful beaches, right? So Copacabana itself is 4 kilometers, and the city, as you can see there, has built right up against the beach. And as you might expect, the beach offers the city extremely high recreational and tourism value. So all along the beach, there are hotels and nightclubs, restaurants and bars, and there's parties every night, and it's just great tourism. Every New Year's Eve, there's a fireworks and concert attracting some 2 million people every year. 2 million people every year just come here and celebrate New Year's. And there's just a massive party on the beach. So that's a lot of fun. So yeah, beaches can be public spaces too. If your city is endowed with a nice beach and good weather and good bikini weather and all that, and surfing weather or swimming weather. Look at that. Look at that city. That city is taking maximum advantage of that beach. Look at that. Making full use of it. If you are not in bikini weather, like in the northern Atlantic coast of the United States, another option for your coastline is a boardwalk. So the climate in the northern Atlantic coast is not as suitable for swimming and sunbathing. And also there's regular hurricanes. So occasionally there'll be storm surges, and then the water will come up, and there'll be winds and rain and everything. So in those conditions, in the harsh weather conditions, putting an elevated wooden walkway is easier and cheaper to build and maintain than trying to build a road on the sand. So they have these elevated wooden walkways along the waterfront. And the tourism or the attractions tend to be tourism and entertainment focused. So even though, it's not really that nice to swim up on the northern Atlantic coast, still the attractions are tourism related because the water is still nice to just walk along. And the Atlantic City Boardwalk is the first boardwalk or the oldest boardwalk in the northern United States, I think. And there's hotels and casinos and restaurants, amusements and other things and shops. So I think you see there's actually there's a cabaret, and that might be a casino there. So yeah, tourism related, and you see all these tourists just kind of milling about, walking along the boardwalk, looking at things. Not quite as much fun as Copacabana Beach, but also fairly useful. So for the 7th exercise in Minecraft, your task is to build a city square or a town square. So in the center of the city is a large patch of gravel. You are to design and build a town square on this site. So what I've basically given you is just a large piece of paving, not unlike Tiananmen Square or Red Square. It's just paving with nothing on it. But I want you to do a little bit better than that, keeping in mind the other town squares that we've looked at in this lecture. Remember that the point of a town square is to have a large open space, so resist the urge to fill it with stuff. Sometimes when you give someone a large empty space, they just kind of put a lot of stuff in it. But remember that it's a town square, so the concept of the town square is that occasionally there are large events with a lot of people, and you really need open space to accommodate all those people. So if you fill the town square with a lot of stuff, like just put fountains and trees and everything everywhere, then it's not really a square anymore. On the other hand, fountains, steps, and other features have been proven to greatly improve public spaces in real life. So some fountains and some trees and sometimes a staircase can really improve things. But you have to figure out a balance between making it not just a boring piece of gravel and not completely filling it in with stuff so it kind of takes up all the space, right? As you design this thing, also consider the relationship between the square and the other parts of the city. Ideally, the different parts of the city should support and enhance each other. So I guess what I'm mainly kind of concerned about is maybe like look at the square from the shops, for example, or look at the square from the residences, and maybe look at the square from the park even, and just make it meaningful or make it sensible. You don't want to like block off the shops from the rest of the city with your square or something crazy like that. Like you want to join things together. You want to link things together, and maybe you want the square to be like an extension of the cafe. Like that would be helpful to the different parts of the city instead of maybe just kind of blocking everything off, which would be weird. So think about that, and yeah, build a town square. I imagine it'll still mostly just be paving, but you might do some nice paving, and maybe you might put a few fountains in it. I don't know. Up to you. So here's the image licenses, and that's it. In the next video, I will have a go at designing a town square. So I'll see you guys there.